with that invitation. Now on to the issue of what you've already done. In Somalia, a drone attack we hear against Al-Shabaab. What can you tell us about whether or not it was successful, whether there was a ground element involved on behalf of the U.S., and why you did it now?
Well, Chris, I'm not in a position at this point in time to confirm any details. We've, of course, seen the same reports. I think it's also important for people to understand that Al-Shabaab is, of course, a terrorist organization. We designated them in 2008. They've claimed credit from everything from the Westgate Mall attack to a range of attacks across northern Africa, and they're one of Al-Qaeda's biggest affiliates in northern Africa. So certainly we take into account, and we do everything we can also to take on this threat. But unfortunately, I don't have any details to confirm for you at this point in time.
Your reaction to the surprise of people who hear that the most urgent situation was Somalia when everyone has ISIS on their brain. Why wasn't the action against ISIS?
Well, first of all, Chris, we have taken steps to take on the threat of ISIL. This president has authorized more than 100 strikes in Iraq, including some over the course of this weekend, to both provide humanitarian assistance and help boost the efforts on the ground and also take on the threat there. But we need to take on threats where they're coming. And so without confirming any details, I can assure you that we have multiple pots on the burner at the same time in terms of protecting the American people and doing what's necessary to do that.
What is more likely, in your estimation? The U.S. working with Syria to attack ISIS or ISIL or the Caliphate or whatever you want to call them, or working with Iran to fight the extension of ISIS or ISIL in Iraq? What's more likely?
Well, Chris, let me introduce a third option, which is something we're actually working on as the United States government, which is building an international coalition with partners around the world, both from the Arab world, from Europe, from Asia, to take on this threat that we're all facing from ISIL. So that's something that President Obama, Secretary Kerry will be spending a lot of time, and Secretary Hagel working on through the course of this week at NATO, and also as we all take trips following NATO to countries around the world to build this. Now, there are a lot of capabilities that countries have. They're not just military. They can be political, they can be diplomatic, they can be financial, and that's the discussion that we're having with the international community.
NATO, you mentioned. Let's move on to that here while I have you. So far, the sanctions haven't seemed to change the mindset or the performance of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now you have NATO. We had an insider on this morning from Russia, a journalist, TV personality. He says NATO is seen as an existential threat to Russia, that it is as likely, the presence of NATO, to make them more aggressive than less aggressive. Your thoughts?
Well, I just simply would disagree with that line of thinking. Ukraine is certainly a friend of NATO. They're not a member of NATO.
Right.
But this will be an issue. Having a discussion about what additional tools are at our disposal, whether that's increased sanctions or other tools, and that will be something that the President and Secretary Kerry will be discussing with many countries who will be attending the NATO summit this week.
Is there a feeling at the State Department that the sanctions are doing anything to Russia? Because the word from within Russia is it's dust off the shoulder.
Well, I think that is simply is not backed up by facts on the ground. We've seen a dramatic impact on the Russian economy, whether it's the amount of capital flight, hundreds of billions of dollars has departed Russia. The economic growth projections in Russia they're now on a downturn. So we've seen an impact on the economy. The question now is, does President Putin care more about his economy and the impact on his people, the people he says he loves and he wants to continue to represent, or does he care more about continuing to take illegal actions as it relates to the neighboring country of Ukraine? That's a conversation we're happy to have, and we're having with our international partners as well.
One thing's for sure, more men, more weaponry flowing into eastern Ukraine from Russia. Jen Psaki, thank you very much for addressing the issues on the table. Always good to have you on New Day. Mick, over to you.
All right, Chris, thanks so much. 13 minutes past the hour. Let's give you a look at your headlines. More than 100 family members of victims attacked by ISIS have stormed Iraq's parliament building in Baghdad. Members of Iraq's military were attacked in June at a camp near Tikrit by the terrorists. Families are demanding now more information about the victims' fates and for their bodies to be returned to them. The legality of the NSA's bulk collection of phone records faces a test in federal court in New York. The panel of judges will be the first appeals court to address the controversial surveillance program. Today's hearing stems from a suit filed by the ACLU that says the bulk collection of phone metadata is a violation of privacy rights and of federal law. A massive search is underway this morning for dozens of teenage boys who escaped from a juvenile detention center in Tennessee. Authorities at the Woodland Hills Youth Development Center say that overnight, 32 boys between the ages of 14 and 18 scaled a fence and fled. 17 boys remain at large. 15 others either turned themselves in or were found by police. They're trying to determine if it was planned or a spontaneous escape. All right, here we go. First looks at photos from Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie's surprise wedding at their estate in France. People magazine has these pictures in their new issue. Jolie's dress, designed by Luigi Massi, features artwork by the couple's children, which I think is darling. Nothing quite as fancy for Mr. Pitt. He wore one of his own suits, apparently, and then had to borrow a tie from one of his sons because he forgot to pack one.
You didn't even show him. There's such a bias toward the bride.
When you're at a wedding, who are you looking at?
Me? The priest. I was looking at the whole time.
Praying that you could make it through. That's a beautiful dress. Am I that unfashionable that I've not heard of this designer? I'm sorry to...
Luigi Massi? I love him. Played football with him in 7th grade.
Really?
Oh, my goodness.
Probably a different
He's
one.
telling lies again, folks.
Did you like the dress?
Fashion
Beautiful.
maven,
And
Chris Cuomo.
I love that they incorporated things
That's
because
adorable.
their kids are such an important part of their family, from what we're told, and the fact that they got to help design the dress.
And there's
darling.
so many of them. Says the woman who can't believe that she could handle one soon.
Oh, you'll see. 1 leads to 3, leads to 5, leads to
Moving
7.
on. As President Obama heads to Europe today, his foreign policy is under fire from both sides of the aisle.
We have new information for you this morning about a U.S. military operation in East Africa. The Pentagon says U.S. forces did hit al-Qaeda-linked terrorists in Somalia, the Al-Shabaab terror network. Now, they've been on U.S. radar since 2008, and the U.S. has targeted the group at least twice in just the past year. The question is, why now, and what did they actually accomplish on the ground, especially with ISIS running free in Iraq and Syria and on everybody's mind? Let's get some good perspective from someone who knows this world very well, Philip Mudd. He's a CNN counterterrorism analyst, a former deputy director of the CIA Counterterrorism Center. Mr. Mudd, good to see you. Everyone says ISIS is the threat. What is this, North Africa? This is the Al-Shabaab, the youthful movement of Al-Qaeda. That's old news. Why are we there?
If you look at what's happened in the history of the Al-Qaeda movement, Al-Qaeda tried to sponsor a revolution globally. That was really the point of the 9/11 attacks. And we saw that revolution crop up in places like Indonesia. We've talked about Yemen in the past. Somalia, though, has been the core of Al-Qaeda affiliate operations in Africa for years. The Somali movement, as you call them, Al-Shabaab, which is the youth, was making great progress in Somalia a few years ago. The combination, though, of African military operations against them, which had pushed them out of the capital, Mogadishu, in 2011, with these drone strikes, has really destroyed, damaged the Al-Shabaab movement, kind of a parallel to what we might see in Iraq. So this is just a continuation of the slow degradation of Al-Shabaab that we've seen for years.
Quick take. You think U.S. had boots on the ground?
I doubt it. I think they've got great collection. You don't get these kinds of point strikes against a target like this without really good intelligence collection. I'm sure they're cooperating with the African Union troops. That's the coalition of African troops, sort of like maybe the kind of coalition we might want to see in Iraq, that's on the ground fighting Shabaab. But I think the collection is probably largely technical, not human boots on the ground.
So we had another analyst on earlier who said, you know what the risk is here? If you ignore Al-Qaeda because you've got ISIS on the brain, you allow Al-Qaeda to develop itself, and they may posture themselves as a voice of moderation in the face of ISIS. What would that mean? Is that realistic at all?
Boy, it's interesting to me as a professional who fought Al-Qaeda for so many years, watching the conversation. It's almost as if we look at the al-Nusra front in Syria and say, hey, they're fighting ISIS, therefore they must be the good guys. Let's remember, between ISIS and Nusra, one of these groups is the Al-Qaeda affiliate. That's Nusra. So let's not, as we fight ISIS, forget the fact that there is a larger, in essence, revolutionary movement out there beyond Iraq in places like North Africa, the Sahel, which is sort of north-central Africa, in Somalia and Yemen. Like al-Nusra, these groups have an ideology that says America's the target. So I understand Nusra in the short term is an advantage to us. They're killing ISIS guys, but they are the al-Qaeda affiliate, and I think we shouldn't forget it.
You know, what I think, you know, in terms of what people are forgetting versus what they're being force-fed is it seems that everybody is attacking the West right now, and it raises an interesting question. Where is, or what is, the role of the Islamic majority in putting down these extremist groups? We don't seem to hear as much about that as we do of what the West is going to do to fight extremism in the Islamic world.
Well, to be blunt, Chris, that's because in some cases this country's myopic. We look at activity overseas, for example, what the U.S. is doing in terms of its force deployments. We don't talk about stuff that's harder to understand, more nuanced. As I watch the Middle Eastern press coming in, you see Middle Eastern political leaders and a lot of religious leaders in places like Saudi Arabia and Egypt talking about ISIS and talking about the horrors of ISIS and telling youth in vulnerable countries like Saudi Arabia that joining ISIS is wrong. The other thing I'd say, Chris, really interesting, is if you look at public relations data, that is polling data across the Middle East, it's hard to get at, but there are some companies that are doing pretty good polling from 9/11 on. Public attitudes in those countries, countries like Jordan, Turkey, are wildly anti-suicide bombing and anti-Al-Qaeda. They weren't as anti-Al-Qaeda 13 years ago. So behind the scenes, as we talk about what we're doing, that is positioning troops, the Middle East is talking about what a scourge ISIS is and how they have a responsibility to prevent youth from going.
But then don't we have to start altering our policy towards invigorating that resistance from those people in the Middle East, you know, not to make it us and them, but to get these countries where a lot of this is percolating to do something about it? Otherwise, you're just going to have more and more reactive policy from here. Witness the UK. De-radicalization classes, good mosques versus bad mosques. I mean, that wouldn't fly here in the U.S. But if that's the direction you're going, that's a bad direction. You need to get that part of the world invested in its own future, don't you?
I think that's why we go back to Somalia. There's an interesting parallel between Iraq and Somalia and what the president is trying to do to build a coalition. One of the successes of Somalia is the fact that it's African troops that supply the boots on the ground, America that supplies drone operations and some of the intelligence. In Iraq, by contrast, we've already got military operations underway led by the U.S., and we're sort of waiting for other countries in the region, the Turks, et cetera, to show up and put boots on the ground. I think one of the reasons for that is not just that these countries can bring military force to bear. It's that the image in a newspaper in a place like Riyadh in Saudi Arabia or Cairo of American operations is a lot different than operations led by, say, Jordanians or Turks. And there's a real psychological advantage to them getting involved.
Absolutely. And we haven't seen it enough. Hell, we don't even talk about it enough. You know, it's good that we brought it up in this discussion now because it's never on the agenda. It's never part of the toolkit for fighting this, like what those actual domestic fronts of where these extremists are coming from, what they're doing about it. It's always about what these outside forces from the West will do. Philip Mudd, thank you very much from the perspective. Always appreciate it.
My pleasure. See you.
All right, so in terms of what the West will do, that comes down to NATO, right? And we have a meeting of the leaders of NATO as the crisis going on with ISIS and in Ukraine specifically heats up. The question is...
Good morning. I'm Carol Costello. Thank you so much for joining me. New this morning, the U.S. military launches clandestine strikes, and the target is thousands of miles from the hotspots that have dominated the headlines in recent weeks. A regional governor in southern Somalia says an apparent drone struck a small village held by the terrorist group Al-Shabaab. That militant group linked to Al-Qaeda carried out the brazen dayside attack on a shopping mall in Nairobi, Kenya last September, killing more than 60 people. You remember that. The U.S. military offensive comes just a day after Al-Shabaab fighters disguised as government troops laid siege to a prison where dozens, possibly hundreds of their comrades are being held. Our global affairs correspondent Elise Labott joins us now from Washington. So, Elise, the president is taking heat for not taking decisive action in Ukraine and Syria. So why Somalia, and why now?
Well, Carol's officials say that, they're kind of sensitive to that, saying, look, we can walk and chew gum at the same time, if you will. And they've been watching Al-Shabaab for some time. As you just said, they pose a growing threat to not just the region, but the world, as Al-Shabaab is planning attacks outside the United States, outside Somalia. And senior U.S. officials are telling me, listen, we had a target of opportunity that presented itself. This meeting of the leader of Al-Shabaab, Ahmed Godane, and some of his top commanders, they were actually meeting in this rebel-held village where the strike took place to talk about this growing, this offensive, how to fend off this offensive by the Somali military and the African Union. And they were all meeting, and this target of opportunity presented itself. And Carol, they don't present themselves that often, so they're constantly watching. This is a continuing threat, and they saw the target and they went after it.
All right, Elise Labott reporting live from Washington this morning. President Obama is not just facing critics on Capitol Hill, he's also taking heat from everyday Americans. A USA Today Pew Research Center poll shows widespread dissatisfaction with the president's handling of crises in the Ukraine and in the Middle East. More than half of Americans feel the president is not tough enough on foreign policy and national security. Yet here's the quandary. Much of the country remains divided over America's exact role in the world. The same poll shows 39% of Americans feel the United States does too much in helping to solve the world's problems. 31% say the United States does